On the morning of October the 26th, 1440, an enormous crowd gathered in a meadow beyond the Loire River, overlooking the walled city of Nantes in northwestern France. They came to witness justice. 3 wooden gibbets stood against the autumn sky, positioned above 3 funeral pyres. The tallest scaffold, the one in the middle, awaited the most notorious prisoner. His name was Gilles de Rais, Baron, Marshal of France, war hero who once fought beside Joan of Arc herself, a man who commanded 200 soldiers and owned castles spanning Brittany and Anjou, a nobleman whose annual revenues exceeded 800,000 livres, and a monster who, over 8 years of systematic predation, tortured and murdered at least 140 children in the towers of those very castles. How did it happen? How did a decorated military hero transform into medieval Europe's most documented predator? How did he operate in plain sight for nearly a decade while parents searched desperately for vanished sons? And what finally stopped him? This is the story of Europe's most untouchable killer, drawn entirely from trial transcripts preserved in the Ecclesiastical archives of Nantes. To understand how such horror could unfold for 8 years without consequence, you must first understand who Gilles de Rais was in the eyes of 15th century France. He was not a shadowy figure lurking at the margins of society, he was its glittering centre. Born around 1405 at Chanteuse Castle on the banks of the Loire, Gilles de Montmorency-Laval descended from 2 of the most powerful feudal dynasties in western France. Through his mother Marie de Craon, he inherited the wealth of the House of Craon. Through his father Guy de Laval, he claimed lineage to the Barons of Retz and the prestigious House of Montmorency. By the standards of his era, he was aristocratic royalty. His childhood ended abruptly in 1415. First his mother Marie died, then his father Guy perished under circumstances now lost to history. At roughly 10 years old, Gilles and his younger brother René became wards of their maternal grandfather Jean de Craon, a shrewd and unscrupulous lord who taught the boy the arts of extortion and banditry. Later, during his final confession, Gilles would blame this upbringing for his crimes, stating he had been raised with unbridled idleness, permitted to please himself with every illicit act, but whatever darkness festered within him remained hidden behind the brilliance of his military career. In 1427, at roughly 22 years old, Gilles entered military service under Duke Louis III of Anjou. He distinguished himself immediately. By 1429, he commanded troops in the most critical campaign of the 100 Years' War, the liberation of Orléans, and it was there in April of that year that he met the woman who would change French history and perhaps seal the trajectory of his own damnation. Her name was Joan of Arc. She was 17, he was 24. Together, they fought at the Siege of Orléans, where English forces had surrounded the city for months. On the 7th of May, 1429, Gilles de Rais stood beside Joan at the decisive Battle of Tourelle. The English were routed. Orléans was liberated. France, which had been losing the war for decades, suddenly had hope. In July, Gilles accompanied Joan to Reims Cathedral, where Charles VII was consecrated King of France. For his service, Gilles de Rais was granted the ultimate military honour, the rank of Marshal of France. He was 24 years old, wealthy beyond measure, decorated with the royal fleur-de-lis, and commanded over 200 men-at-arms. Chroniclers described his entourage as rivaling that of princes. When he travelled to the city of Nantes, he was accompanied by guards, esquires, pages, chaplains, singers, and astrologers, all dressed in lavish silk and gold. He was untouchable, and he knew it. On the 30th of May 1431, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen. Captured by the English the previous year, she had been tried for heresy and witchcraft. Her execution was brutal and public. Gilles de Rais was not present, but her death, by all contemporary accounts, shattered something fundamental within him. The chronicles suggest he withdrew from public life shortly thereafter. His military career, once so brilliant, simply stopped. He participated in one final inconsequential expedition in 1434. After that, he never returned to battle. Instead, he returned to his estates, and on the 15th of November, 1432, his grandfather Jean de Craon died. With Jean's death, Gilles inherited complete control of a vast network of lands spanning Brittany, Anjou, Poitou and Maine. Castles at Machecoul, Teforges, Champtos, Puzourges, lordships over dozens of parishes. An annual income that some estimates placed at 30,000 livres tournois from his estates alone, plus nearly 20,000 more from his position as marshal. He was, by any measure, among the wealthiest lords in France. But wealth for Gilles was meant to be spent. Within 2 years, he had begun hemorrhaging his fortune on spectacular excesses. He sponsored mystery plays commemorating the liberation of Orléans, spending the equivalent of millions in modern currency on elaborate costumes that were worn once and discarded. He maintained a private chapel furnished with silk tapestries and gem-encrusted sacred vessels. He hosted feasts where spectators were served wine and delicacies at his expense. His family grew alarmed. In 1435, his relatives petitioned King Charles VII to place him under interdict, legally prohibiting him from selling property or entering contracts. The king agreed, but by then something far darker than financial ruin had begun. According to trial records preserved in the Archives départementales de Loire-Atlantique, the murders began in late 1432 or early 1433, shortly after Jean de Crayon's death. The first victims remain unnamed in the surviving documents, but the pattern was already forming. Children who begged for alms near the gates of Machecoul Castle began to disappear. At first, their absences went unnoticed. These were the sons and daughters of peasants, day labourers, landless families. They had no advocates, no political power. When parents came to the castle to inquire, they were turned away by servants who shrugged or offered vague reassurances that the children would return soon. They never did. Gilles had also developed an obsession with alchemy and the occult. He believed he could restore his vanishing fortune through conjury by summoning demons who would grant him gold and power. Between 1439 and 1440, he participated in at least 10 to 12 invocation rituals at his castles of Tiffauges and Machecoul. In these ceremonies, directed by a young Florentine conjurer named François Prelati, Gilles would stand inside circles traced in the dirt with the tip of a sword, holding signed pacts promising the devil anything except his soul and his life. He later testified that despite his efforts, he never actually saw or spoke to the devil, though he became convinced others in his circle had. His frustration at the devil's refusal to appear gnawed at him. Prelati told him the demons were displeased with his offerings, so Gilles began preparing new ones. According to testimony given during his trial, in late 1439, he prepared an offering consisting of the severed hand, heart and eyes of a boy he had recently murdered. He placed these remains on glass, covered them with linen, and presented them during an invocation ritual. Still, the devil did not come, but by then, Gilles de Rais no longer needed demonic encouragement. The killing had become its own compulsion. The primary location of Gilles de Rais' crimes was Machecoul Castle, located in Brittany near the Bay of Bourgneuf. Machecoul was the head of his barony, a sprawling fortress surrounded by salt marshes and accessible primarily along the Loire River. It was remote, it was fortified, and within its walls, specifically within the stone tower that overlooked the marshlands, Gilles de Rais constructed a private chamber of systematic murder. The method was chillingly consistent, as later described in the sworn testimony of his accomplices during the trial of October 1440. The children were acquired through deception. Gilles employed a network of servants whose task was to identify suitable victims. They would station themselves near the castle gates where poor children often gathered to beg for alms. The servants distributed food, coins and clothing. If a beautiful boy appeared in the group, the servant would engage him in conversation, asking about his ambitions. Many boys expressed the hope of becoming soldiers, pages, or singers in noble households. The servant would then offer precisely that, a position in the household of Marshal Gilles de Rais, war hero of France. To parents, this seemed like divine fortune. Their sons would escape poverty, learn trades, perhaps even rise to prominence. Some parents protested, but most, desperate and trusting in the Baron's heroic reputation, gave their consent. The boys were led through the castle gates. The drawbridge was raised. The gates were closed. They never left. According to the confession of Henriet Griart, one of Gilles' primary accomplices, the first child Henriet personally delivered was the son of a woman named Catherine, wife of a man named Thierry who lived in Nantes. She had asked that her son be admitted as a chorister in the Baron's chapel. Henriet led the boy to Gilles' chamber at Machecoul. There, Gilles and another servant named Poitou made the boy swear an oath of secrecy. Henriet then returned to Nantes for 3 days. When he came back to Machecoul, the boy was gone. He had been told the child was dead. This, Henriet testified, occurred approximately 4 years before the trial, placing it around 1436 or 1437. But the killing had begun earlier. The pattern Henriet described was this. Once the children were brought into Gilles' private chamber, they were restrained. Some were suspended from the ceiling by cords looped around their necks, hung approximately 3 feet off the ground so they could neither stand nor escape but remained conscious and terrified. Others were hung from hooks embedded in the stone walls. Gilles would then approach them. The trial records, translated from medieval French and Latin, describe acts of profound depravity. Gilles would commit sexual acts upon the children, focusing particularly on what the documents describe as unnatural methods that stopped short of full violation. He would excite himself and ejaculate upon their bodies. The children, gagged or strangled just enough to prevent screaming, would thrash in their restraints. When Gilles had finished, the murders began. Sometimes Gilles cut their throats himself using a dagger called a braquemard. Other times, he ordered his servants to do it while he watched. According to Henriet's testimony, Gilles took greater pleasure in watching the children die than in the sexual acts themselves. He would study their faces as the blood drained from their severed arteries. After decapitation, he would examine the severed heads, selecting the ones he found most beautiful. He kissed these heads. He kept some on display in his chamber for days. When asked why, Gilles would later say only that it pleased him, that no man alive could ever understand what he had done, and that it was because of his planet, his natal star, that such things occurred. The disposal method was brutally efficient. Once the children were dead, their bodies were burned in the large fireplace within Gilles' sleeping chamber. Henriet and another accomplice named Poitou would place heavy logs on the andirons, stack dry faggots on top, then lay the small bodies across the flames. The burning occurred at night while Gilles lay in bed nearby. To prevent detection, they burned the children's clothing piece by piece so the smoke would be less noticeable. The ashes were then scattered across the castle grounds or dumped into the Loire River. At Machecoul alone, Henriet testified, approximately 40 children were murdered and burned in this manner over a period of years. But Machecoul was not the only site. Gilles owned multiple castles, and the murders followed him wherever he travelled. At his childhood home of Champteaux, children disappeared from the surrounding villages. When Gilles sold Champteaux Castle in 1438 for 100,000 gold crowns, he ordered 5 of his manservants to enter the tower before the new owner took possession. Their task was to remove the skeletal remains of approximately 40 children whose bodies had been stored there. These remains were placed in 3 coffers and transported, much of the journey by boat, to Machecoul, where they were burned to ash. 2 skeletons were missed. When the new owner discovered them, rumours began to spread. At Tiffauges Castle, which Gilles had acquired through marriage to Catherine de Thouars, additional victims were taken. In Nantes, at a townhouse Gilles owned called La Suze, Henriet testified that children were brought, murdered in the upstairs bedroom and burned in the fireplace while Gilles remained in bed. Among those killed, there were the son of a man named Gibelet de Lis, the son of Jean Hubert, the son of Donette, and the son of Lémion, all 4 from Nantes. The selection criteria were specific. Gilles preferred boys between the ages of 7 and 15, though he occasionally took girls. He favoured children with delicate features, pale skin, and soft voices. If 2 brothers were brought together, he would abuse only one but kill both to ensure the survivor could not bear witness. He avoided children from prominent families or those with fathers who held positions of minor authority. His victims were the sons of day labourers, beggars, widows, and tenant farmers, people, in other words, whose grief carried no political weight. And for 8 years, from approximately 1432 until 1440, this continued. 140 children, according to the indictment read at his trial, perhaps as many as 200, according to some historians. The exact number will never be known, but the method, the locations, and the identities of his accomplices are all preserved in the trial transcripts archived in Nantes, and they make for the most disturbing judicial record of the entire medieval period. For years, parents in the villages surrounding Machecoul, Tiffauges, and Champteaux knew something terrible was happening, but they were powerless. Peasants in the 15th century had no legal recourse against a baron, especially one who carried the title of Marshal of France. When mothers came to the castle gates asking about their missing sons, guards turned them away. When fathers demanded answers, they were threatened with violence. Some families, terrified of reprisal, simply stopped asking, but the grief remained. And slowly, over the course of the 1430s, rumours began to spread. Peasants working fields near Machecoul Castle reported strange occurrences. At night, red glares could be seen flickering from the high casement windows of the tower. Occasionally, they heard cries, thin and distant, coming from within the stone walls, but no one dared investigate. A baron's castle was inviolable. To trespass meant death. Still, the stories circulated, and by 1439, the volume of missing children had grown impossible to ignore. Entire families had lost sons. The parish records showed gaps. Mothers gathered in churches and spoke in frightened tones about the baron's household, about the well-dressed servants who promised their boys futures, about the children who vanished. Then, in May of 1440, Gilles de Rais made a catastrophic mistake. It had nothing to do with the murders. In a dispute over the property, Gilles stormed into the church of Saint-Étienne de Mer-Morte with 40 armed men and abducted a cleric named Jean Le Ferrand, brother of the nobleman who had purchased one of Gilles' estates. Gilles imprisoned the cleric in irons. This was not merely a crime, it was a profound violation of ecclesiastical immunity. The church could no longer ignore him. Jean Le Ferron's brother Geoffroy had powerful allies. Within months, the Duke of Brittany intervened, dispatching his constable with 20 men to liberate the imprisoned cleric. And with that intervention came scrutiny. The Bishop of Nantes, Jean de Malestroit, launched a formal investigation in July 1440. For the first time, parents were invited to give testimony, either in person or through written depositions, and they came, dozens of them. On the 29th of July 1440, Bishop de Malestroit published the results of his investigation. The findings were damning. On the 15th of September 1440, Gilles de Rais was arrested at his castle in Machecoul. Accompanying him into custody were his accomplices, the conjurer François Prelati, the priest Eustache Blanchet, and the two servants, Henriet, Griart and Poitou. The secular inquest began on the 18th of September at the fortress in Nantes. A commissioner named Jean de Toucheronde was appointed to take evidence. One by one, witnesses entered the chamber. Each knelt, made the sign of the cross, and swore to tell the truth. The first to testify was Péronne Louessard, the mother from Roche-Bernard, whose 10-year-old son had been taken 2 years earlier. She recounted how the servant Poitou had approached her boy, how he had promised military training, how she had protested but been overruled with money. She described asking Baron de Rais to treat her son kindly. He had made no reply, but Poitou had said the boy was beautiful as an angel. She never saw him again. After Péronne came others. A shoemaker from Machecoul testified about the sudden disappearance of a boy last seen picking apples. He said families were afraid to speak, fearing violent reprisals from the Baron's men. A woman from La Boucardière testified that she had left her 8-year-old son at home to care for his infant sister while she planted hemp. When she returned, her daughter remained, but her son was gone, never to be seen again. Witness after witness described sons sent to buy bread in Machecoul who never returned. Boys who disappeared while tending sheep or chasing butterflies in the woods. An 18-year-old last seen playing with a ball of thread near the castle. A 12-year-old who vanished after being asked to carry a message to the Baron's household. The testimonies went on for 3 weeks. While the secular inquest continued gathering witness testimony, parallel ecclesiastical trial began on the 19th of September. The ecclesiastical court was far more powerful. It could charge heresy, sodomy, and violations of church law. On the 13th of October 1440, Gilles de Rais was brought before the Bishop of Nantes and the Vicar of the Inquisition in the upper hall of La Tourneuve Castle. The prosecutor read a bill of indictment consisting of 49 articles. The charges included the murder and torture of 140 children, heresy through the invocation of demons, and the assault on Jean Le Ferron. Gilles' response was defiant. He denied the authority of the ecclesiastical judges. He told them he would rather be hanged by a rope around his neck than respond to their charges. The judges promptly excommunicated him. But excommunication in the 15th century carried existential terror. To die excommunicate meant eternal damnation. 2 days later, Gilles recanted. He accepted the authority of the court and admitted tearfully that he had maliciously committed the crimes of which he stood accused. The judges lifted his excommunication. Then almost immediately, Gilles backtracked again, admitting only to minor details. The prosecutor had anticipated this. Over the next 4 days, he called 19 witnesses, including the two servants Henriet and Poitou, the conjurer Prelati, the priest Blanchet, and a woman named Perrine Martin, who had procured children for the Baron. Their testimonies were devastating. Henriet described in meticulous detail how children were suspended by cords, how Gilles sexually abused them, how throats were cut and heads examined for beauty. Poitou corroborated everything. Prelati described the occult rituals and the offerings of severed body parts. When the testimony concluded on the 20th of October, the prosecutor turned to Gilles and asked if he had anything to say. Gilles said he did not. The prosecutor then reminded him that the court had the power to apply torture in order to scrutinize the truth more thoroughly. The threat worked. On the 21st of October, Gilles de Rais made his first full confession in private, before a notary and several officials. But it was the following day, the 22nd of October, that the true horror emerged. Standing before the bishop and the vicar of the Inquisition, Gilles de Rais confessed publicly, with what witnesses described as great contrition of heart and a great effusion of tears. He admitted to perpetrating high and enormous crimes against God and his commandments since the beginning of his youth. He blamed the lax education he received from his grandfather, the unbridled idleness, the excessive drinking. He described how he would ejaculate on the bellies of dying children, how he embraced their corpses, how he examined severed heads and kissed the most beautiful ones. He admitted that he took pleasure in watching them die, in seeing their internal organs exposed after their bodies were cut open. He confessed to committing these acts on so many children but he could not determine the number with certainty. And then, in a moment that stunned the court, he asked that his confession be printed in the French language as a warning to all parents to raise their children with discipline and virtue. He implored the parents and friends of the murdered children to forgive him, and he asked God for mercy. The courtroom was silent. On the 25th of October, Gilles de Rais was found guilty in his ecclesiastical trial of heresy, sodomy, and the murder of children. He was sentenced to excommunication and made subject to other lawful punishments. Immediately thereafter, he faced the secular court at the fortress of Le Bouffay, where he confessed again and was sentenced to be hanged and burned. The execution was set for the following day, the 26th of October, at 11 in the morning. On the morning of October 26th, 1440, Gilles de Rais and his two servants, Henriet, Griart and Poitou, were led in a solemn procession from La Tourneuve Castle to the meadow beyond the Loire where the crowd had gathered. An immense throng followed, chanting prayers and singing hymns. Contemporary accounts describe the atmosphere as both mournful and vengeful. These were the parents of the murdered, the siblings, the neighbours who had spent years wondering what happened to the vanished children. Before ascending the scaffold, Gilles knelt before the crowd and begged their forgiveness. Then he turned to Henriet and Poitou, the two men who had helped him kill for 8 years, and said, "We have sinned, all three of us, but as soon as our souls depart our bodies, we shall all see God in his glory in heaven." It was the last statement recorded in the trial documents. The three men were hanged. When the flames burned through Gilles' rope, 4 women of high rank rushed forward to snatch his body from the fire. According to the chronicler Jean Chartier, they placed his remains in a coffin and buried him in the church of Notre-Dame du Carmel in Nantes. Henriet and Poitou were not granted the same mercy, their bodies burned completely. The trial of Gilles de Rais sent shockwaves through France. For the first time, a man of his stature, a Marshal of France and companion in arms to Joan of Arc, had been publicly tried and executed for crimes against common children. The case became a reference point in legal and ecclesiastical discussions for decades. Some historians argue it represents one of the earliest documented cases of what we would now term serial predation. Others caution against applying modern criminological categories to medieval contexts. What is not in dispute, however, is the documentary evidence. The trial transcripts exist, the witness testimonies exist, the confessions exist, and they tell the story of 140 children, mostly boys, who sought alms at the gates of a baron's castle and never came home. This has been the documented case of Gilles de Rais, preserved in the Ecclesiastical Archives of Nantes and the trial records of October 1440. If you found this account valuable, consider sharing it with others who seek historical truth over sensationalized mythology. Medieval history is not a collection of fairy tales. It is a record of real human beings, real suffering, and real systemic failures that allowed predators to operate with impunity for years. At Dark Crowns, we will continue to excavate these stories from the archives, always with respect for the victims and always grounded in documentation. Next week, we examine another authenticated case from the medieval records, the systematic abuse carried out by a monastery in 13th century England, as documented in ecclesiastical visitation reports. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe this work matters, support us on Patreon so we can continue researching these forgotten histories. Until next time, remember the lost, honour the victims, and never forget that the worst monsters in history were often the ones society celebrated. I am your host. This is Dark Crowns. Thank you for bearing witness.